So I have this 101. We're going to get started. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone to the fourth. This is our fourth session in the Administrator Forum Series. We will be providing other sessions throughout the remaining 2023 school year. These sessions are being presented as a virtual conference sponsored by the Illinois State Board of Education and coordinated by Early Childhood Professional Learning, which is a project of the Center, Resources for Teaching and Learning.
So
my name is Cindy Berry, and I'm Director of Early Childhood Professional Learning. So we have a few housekeeping items before we get started. Due to the large number of participants, your microphones will be muted throughout the session. We ask that you keep your microphones on mute, please. However, the chat will remain open for your comments and questions. Today's session will be recorded, as you heard, and the recording will be posted on the ECPL YouTube channel within the upcoming week. At this time, I do want to remind everyone, please stay on till the end of the session because we have some important announcements at the end that Susie will share with you. And at this time, I would like to introduce Jenny Metcalf, who is the ISB Principal Consultant in the Early Childhood Department.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our fourth administrator session. Hope you all had nice holidays. We are excited for this topic, me in particular, because working with the monitoring and compliance checklist, we get a lot of questions about lesson planning. So today we have Emily Dorsey here from the Illinois Early Learning Project, which is also an ISB Early Childhood funded initiative, and she is going to talk about high quality lesson plans. This session is not about compliance, though Emily's slides will incorporate the compliance requirements. This is more about creating high quality lesson plans for your individual students, but hopefully we will answer your questions regarding that. But if we don't, feel free to email me at earlychi@isb.net if you have specific questions on compliance. That's earlychi@isbe.net. And also you can write your questions in the chat. We'll try to answer the ones we can. We get a large number. We might not be able to get to all of them. So thank you for coming today and welcome, Emily.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Jenny? Just want to make sure that I'm
Yes, you're good.
All right. Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. As Jenny and Cindy indicated, this session today is lesson planning for early learners, creating high quality plans and adapting for individual students. I'm giving this presentation on behalf of the Illinois State Board of Education Early Childhood Department. It's Administrator Forum Session 4 on today's January 19th. And here we are at 1 to 2:30 p.m. So thank you all for coming, making this part of your workday. I really appreciate the large number of you that wanted to be here today, and I'm grateful to be able to present. So let me just go ahead and get started. See if I can. All right, there's my next slide here. All right, so the first thing I want to say is just in terms of a little bit of housekeeping, I was not expecting such a large number of people here today. I'm really grateful that you all wanted to attend, but I think it's not very feasible that I'll be able to keep up with the chat box. So if you put questions for clarification in there, Susie or Jenny will notice those and flag me to answer them along the way. But if you have any larger questions for discussion, we can address those at the end, and that should work out well. I left a little time for that. And I hope it's okay to ask, someone has a microphone on and it's playing music, like nap time music in the background. If you could check to see if that's you and mute it, that would be very helpful to me. Thank you. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Emily Dorsey. I am the project director and co-principal investigator at Illinois Early Learning. Illinois Early Learning is also funded by the ISB Early Childhood Department. And so it's something that's familiar to me. I get to chat with the people at ISB about what's going on in the state. And so I get to stay on top of Preschool for All. And again, I'm just going to ask one more time, if you are the person with the music, if you could please check and mute that. It's hard for me to focus with hearing that in the background right now. So one of the things that we have on our website, the Illinois Early Learning and Development, is the Illinois Early Learning and Development Standards. And so the preschool teachers in your program and you may visit our website from time to time to look at those. And also I stay up to date with early care and education around the state, as well as specifically in Illinois. And so our website, Illinois Early Learning, if you come to us, you will see long-standing topics that are always important in early childhood, like math and literacy, as well as hot topics or new and current events. So for example, if you visit our website now, you will see a whole new set of tip sheets and resource lists on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we invite you to visit our website at any time. We'd love to have you come and take a look around. It's a great place. All right, let me just click my next slide here. Sorry. All right, so today's agenda, okay, let me just give you a little information about my background in education. I'll kind of bounce back and forth between my education and my career path to give you a sense of my own background and experience related to lesson plans. And hopefully that will give you a good idea of kind of where I'm coming from and why I might be a person who's excited to talk to you about lesson planning today, which is a great topic. So I started my career in with a bachelor's degree of science and early childhood education with a special education approval, and started my career as an early childhood special education teacher. So setting that you're all very familiar with right now. I then went back to school to get a master's of education in curriculum and instruction, and moved into a position of being a self-employed special education consultant, supporting children with disabilities in a variety of settings, so young children. And the reason I was supporting those children was because I was in another state, not Illinois, but their families were not having positive experiences with inclusive settings in early childhood. And so they were pulling their students out into private settings and hiring me to help. And I realized I was supporting people who could not only afford a private program, but who could also afford to pay me. And I was not satisfied with that situation. And so that's what led me to pursue a PhD in early childhood special education, because I really wanted to focus on preparing early childhood teachers and pre-service teachers and support practicing teachers to create more inclusive spaces for young children with disabilities. So after that, I went on to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where I became a faculty member in their inclusive early childhood education program. And I supported pre-service teachers as they began their career, learning how to include children with disabilities in their classrooms. And I'm from Champaign. I was going to start out by sharing a little anecdote with you. I'm not originally from Champaign. I'm originally from Rockford, but I've spent a lot of time in Champaign. I love it here. I didn't really think we'd ever get to come back. And lo and behold, the director position for Illinois Early Learning opened up in 2019. And so my family and I got to come home to Champaign. I love this job. I love being the director of Illinois Early Learning. I love Champaign. I was going to tell you all that last night I took my children and my husband to the Illini women's basketball game versus Indiana. We did not win, but it was fun and exciting. And my children, who are 8 and 10, were dancing and cheering them on, and got featured on the Jumbotron, which was very exciting to them. So they considered it a win. So if you're ever in Champaign, come visit Illinois Early Learning, come see a basketball game. It's a great place. But just a little aside there, so you get to know me a little bit on a personal level. But all that to say that at every step of my education and career, I've either been writing lesson plans or helping others learn to write them. And I think it's an important thing to do. I take pride in it, and I always think about how in doing that, we can include young children with disabilities in all of our early childhood settings. So that's my main focus. And so I just wanted to give you that kind of background. Let me just go over today's agenda to tell you a little bit about what our plan of attack is. And I just quickly pulled up the chat. I can see all of your cheers for ILLINI, and I appreciate that very much. Go Illini. So today's agenda, we're going to first talk about why do we have lesson plans, just kind of thinking about, the benefits and the reasons for them. We will talk about writing and using lesson plans and how people do that at different stages of their career. We will talk about high quality lesson plans and what that means in terms of the elements we want to include in the lesson plan, and also the process that you work through when you create a lesson plan. And I really hope that one of the things you take away from today's presentation is that process, as opposed to the product, is really the beneficial aspect of lesson planning. So kind of tuck that thought away as we walk through today. Then we'll move towards thinking about individualizing lesson plans, which I know is something that people have been curious about in terms of the compliance checklist. And we'll talk about the difference between individualization and accommodations. And we'll also talk about the difference between individualization and universal design for learning, and think about how those three things of individualization, accommodations, and UDL all work together as strategies when we're planning. Towards the end of the presentation, I want to share with you some IEL resources that support lesson planning, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So again, if anybody wasn't quite here at the very beginning, if you have questions for clarity along the way, if I've said something that doesn't make sense, feel free to pop that in the chat, and Jenny or Cindy will verbally flag me down to stop and answer that. And the bigger stuff we can save for the end. So there's our agenda. So let's just jump right in this is really more of a thought exercise. It's really more for you than for anybody else. So to tell you the truth, I had no idea 210 people were going to be here when I suggested putting your answer in the chat. So that's an optional part of this exercise. But just to get us thinking, I want to do an exercise of, if someone said to you, why do we need lesson plans? And you just had a couple sentences to reply, what would you say to them? So if it's a teacher, a parent, a stranger in an elevator, first thing that comes into your head, what would you say about why we need lesson plans? And again, feel free to throw that in the chat and or just think about that for a moment and think about what you think about as the purpose of lesson plans. And so obviously with 200 and some of you, I won't be able to go through all these in the chat, but feel free to look at each other's answers and to kind of hold your own answer in your head as we walk through today, and see if at the end of the session, maybe a new reason or purpose came to your mind or got explained a little bit better, or it makes you think critically about lesson planning in the future. So that's just to get us started, kind of get us on the topic. So I'll go ahead and jump in with some of these. Aren't my ideas. I mean, these are well-known ideas, but we'll get talking through what are the benefits of lesson planning. So here's on the slide, what are the benefits of lesson planning? And I kind of want to highlight the fact that you'll see my sentence starter here is lesson planning offers teachers these things. So really the process of planning can offer some benefits to teachers. One thing is that it's a place to describe key components of a teaching opportunity. I mean, really just nuts and bolts, logistics, getting it down on paper, thinking through what you're going to do, what you need. That is a helpful thing in terms of getting ready to teach. You know, it's a little bit of an obvious answer, but it's true. It's that time when we can plan for what's going to happen, get everything organized. The next one here is that it is a chance to think critically about what they're trying to accomplish during a teaching opportunity. So just to give you a little example, let's say a teacher is, they want to address a math benchmark in their teaching, and they decide they want to use an art project to do that. And then they also think, gosh, something I want to accomplish today is to have the children have some creative expression in this work. Well, then they work through their lesson plan and, you know, they decide to do a craft that works on shapes and measuring or something like that. And as they're thinking through the lesson, they're realizing, gosh, what I've planned here is something what everything ends up in the same sort of final product. And I thought I wanted to accomplish some like chance for creative expression here today. And so as they're thinking through that, they can kind of realize that there's maybe a mismatch in what they were hoping to accomplish and what they planned, and they can, you know, work accordingly. Maybe they'll change that lesson. Maybe they'll think of another time to include creative expression. But sometimes when you take the time to really think critically about what you're planning, it gives you a chance to reflect on those mismatches or those missed opportunities, or unintended consequences, things like that. And so it's a little bit of a reflective act, and that can be very nice for teachers to get that chance to think through what they were hoping to do. And the last thing on this slide is, again, more of a nuts and bolts, is it's a process for working through the logistics of an upcoming lesson. I kind of think of this similar to like when you're thinking through the logistics of an upcoming trip or something. Maybe you're, you know, planning out what you're going to do when, and you know, like you're the teacher thinking through the lesson, you're like, oh, I'm going to do it at the circle table. And then you're like, oh, I can't do the circle table because, you know, we have some art projects drawing there. And I was going to do it on Tuesday at noon, but we have that assembly at Tuesday at noon. And so, I mean, it's really just that chance to work through the logistics, realize where you might need to make some tweaks and adjustments. And so, you know, the benefits are on the one hand very practical, and then they're also very theoretical for teachers. And so all this to say that, you know, maybe lesson planning isn't the favorite thing of some of the teachers that you work with. But I think if we can go back to remind people that they really do have a lot of benefits, the process of creating a lesson plan yields a lot of benefits for teachers. That can be a little bit of a motivator to kind of get back into it, because you're seeing those benefits pay off as you're doing it. So just a little selling point for lesson planning there. So now we've kind of talked about those benefits and maybe some of those aligned with the why that you thought of when you put it in a chat box. I want to talk about how pre-service teachers learn to write lesson plans, because I think that sometimes if we think back to how that occurred, it might make a little sense about why people are hesitant to keep doing it, because it, you know, it's a hefty process. So usually when I think about myself as a pre-service teacher, or myself preparing teachers, had lots and lots of opportunities to write lesson plans in undergraduate courses or in graduate courses about teaching. In almost any course, you know, you have an opportunity to write a lesson plan, usually in your methods courses on different topics like math and literacy, or on your curriculum courses and your special education courses. You would write them as sort of class assignments that, you know, you may or may not use in real life, but it was a big thing to do. As pre-service teachers are learning to write lesson plans, they're often asked to provide a lot of attention to detail, just incredible attention to what's going to happen in the process, and really thinking through every single aspect of a lesson. When I prepared teachers at the University of Nebraska, I used to sort of jokingly, but not really, say to them, when it comes to lesson planning, more is more. Like, not less is more. Like, you're going for it. You're thinking through everything at this stage of the game. And then often how those would be executed is that, the student teacher or the undergraduate student would write that lesson plan, conduct the lesson while being observed, and the supervisor would follow along in the lesson plan and watch to see what was going well, what needed improvement. And it was really a point by point discussion of that lesson as it was planned and as it was executed, and they were graded, and it was very formal. And I support that process. I think that's a really good learning process. But I also think that sometimes we forget that you kind of move forward from that as a professional. And what I like to think about it is kind of like an analogy of learning to drive. So when you're learning to drive, you're paying attention to like all those things, like who's in the lane next to you, how to operate the controls of the car, how to operate the lights, the radio, parallel parking, different lanes, and all that. And it's overwhelming because you're taking it all in and doing it. When you become an experienced driver, you still actually have to do all those things. Like, the importance of knowing if you're in your lane never goes away, but it becomes second nature, becomes much easier. And then you can focus on improvement. I mean, I think that's a good way to think about lesson planning. So, when we're learning to lesson plan, it's very intense. But as we work with practicing teachers, it's really more about improving lesson plans and kind of knowing that some of those like tight logistical things are maybe not so hard anymore. And we can focus on the process and improving the lesson plans. And so that's kind of where I want to take you today with this discussion. So not digging into like the tiny details of a lesson plan, but really thinking how we're going to improve it by individualizing for different students. Which brings me to my next point of, how do actual teachers write and use lesson plans, which is different. I am sure that your, experienced teachers are not writing out the sort of lesson plans that an undergraduate hands in for a methods course. Your actual teachers are creating practical documents for guiding day-to-day classroom activities. And when I thought about this, I really thought about how all of us do this. And what is a practical document it varies depending on your context and your experience with something and what you need. So I thought about my own life, my own job, and like a few of the practical documents that I use. Like, one of the things I make is sort of a matrix for my week that just says like every day of the week, and it says what meetings I have and what big things I got to get done. And it lists the people on my team and the big things they got to get done. It's an at a glance, very practical. But then on the other hand, when I do something like this, like a presentation, or I lead a meeting that's got an intense topic of discussion, I do some tight, detailed planning, very detail oriented written work to get ready for something. And, teachers do that too. And so some of the documents they use for planning could be very loosely structured and sparse. And some of them are going to be very detail oriented and explicit. And so when you think about lesson plans,
Excuse me.
Yes.
Hi, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have individuals that are waiting to get in. Are you able to let them into the meeting?
Oh,
I'm
Susie should
not.
be able to do that. Emily, you can go ahead. We'll make sure Susie does that.
Okay. Okay. So all lesson plans won't look the same. You really got to think about what their purpose is. A second thing that actual teachers do with lesson plans is they might use them as an instruction manual, either for themselves. So if you're teaching a brand new curriculum and you really want to make sure you get it right, Or more likely, if you have other staff members or substitutes or student teachers using your plans, they have to be written well enough for someone else to execute them. Kind of think of like IKEA directions here. The proof is in the pudding, you know, can somebody else get this done? And so that's another actual use of lesson plans. And then the other thing to keep in mind is, you know, form follows function. So, you know, what do you really need to describe what's going to happen in this plan? It might not be a fancy, you know, template or document. You know, if you've said what you need to say and included the parts of the lesson that need to be included, it could be handwritten, it could be quickly typed up. You know, it might not look like a sort of thing you would hand in as an undergraduate, but it's functional and effective. And then by the same token, I have seen plenty of lesson plans that looked very, very nice, but actually didn't accomplish their task. And so I think that's just another important thing to keep in mind. It's just that there's not a certain way that lesson plans have to look, and they will vary depending on the task at hand. Okay, oops, my slides are jumping around. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked through all those purposes of lesson planning, I want to talk through the elements in a high quality lesson plan. So what would you expect to see in a lesson plan that is well written and high quality? So the first thing is connection to standards and benchmarks, and we'll talk about how important this is as we go through today. But that's the first thing. It's the number one on the list, and that's the thing you're always thinking about first. Is what's my purpose in teaching today? Which benchmark am I trying to address? After that, you'll think about objectives. So those sentences like students what will they learn? What will they accomplish? And here's a good spot to also include any new vocabulary that the students are going to learn. Lesson plans usually include contextual information, sort of setting, like the when, the where, the how long. You've got materials, including books. Usually there's things involved in a lesson. And you've got your teaching plan or your method of instruction, which would include what the teacher is going to say and ask the children. You know, also what you're going to do, and then also the assessment for determining if students have accomplished the goals of the lesson. So how are you going to know if your lesson was successful? Now on this slide, you can see I have a couple of asterisks. These are the things that I know are included on a compliance checklist. So connection to the standards and benchmarks, that really should be in every lesson plan. Then you can see I've got my list of 1 through 6, and then down at the bottom here, I've got and individualization. Also very important for lesson planning, for the compliance, but I don't have it as number 7, and we'll talk about why later. I really want to distinguish this sort of as a separate part of the process, but you know, as we'll define it now, and we'll continue to define it throughout the presentation today, individualization is changing the plan in big or small ways to ensure each student can accomplish the goals of the lesson. And there's lots of ways to individualize, and that's what we're going to get to here as we go through the slides. So we've got our 1 through 6 and our individualization. So to illustrate this, this is a graphic that hopefully is at a glance that can kind of show you what I meant by and individualization instead of putting it down at the bottom of the list. So you can see at the top of this chart, we've got our standard or our benchmark, and that's the anchor. That's the heart and soul of the lesson. It's the thing that you are wanting to accomplish with the students. Then after that, you can work through the lesson here. You've got your objectives, and including vocabulary. And you can individualize at that juncture in the lesson. You've got the contextual information, the when, the where, the how long. And at that juncture, you can individualize. Same with the materials, including your books. At this part of the lesson, you might individualize. Got your teaching plan, including method and questions for students. And you might individualize here. And then you've got your assessment, and you might individualize here. So it's really a way of pointing out that there's the key elements in the lesson planning, and individualization is linked to all of those except for the benchmark. The benchmark remains the same for all the students. That's the thing you're trying to accomplish. So if we talk through the process of creating the lesson plan, this is what it might look like here. First, you're going to determine the learning goal. And I would say aim for the benchmark level. So I am not sure if I can hold anything up on the screen right now and have you see it, but this is the Illinois Early Learning and Development Standards. And I'm assuming most of you are familiar with those. They are housed on the Illinois Early Learning website, but just in case, I want to talk through how they're organized briefly. So how they're organized is first, and these are the things we're trying to teach children. That's what we want people to learn in grades 3 to 5, or not grades 3 to 5, ages 3 to 5, preschool. So the way they're organized is first you have the overarching subject matter. So you'd have, math or language arts. Then beneath that, we have goals. Beneath that, we have standards. And then the smallest unit is the benchmark. And I generally think for lesson planning, aiming for that benchmark level is the best way to aim, as opposed to a standard or a goal. And we'll have examples of benchmarks as we go through the slides. So you'll get to kind of see what a benchmark looks like if you're not interacting with them all the time. But after you've determined that benchmark, which is again, the real anchor of the teaching, then you can select an activity. And then you build from there. So you'll build the context, the materials, the procedure, and the assessment. And so this next slide has a highly simplified example of that process. But one thing I want to point out is if you're using a template or if you're using some sort of structure for lesson planning that you want teachers to use, or you're guiding them through it, I'd say it's very important to put that benchmark at the top of the form. Or if you're discussing a lesson plan, make that benchmark the start of the discussion. So rather than saying to a teacher, what activity are you doing today? You would say to a teacher, which benchmark are you aiming for today? What benchmark are you addressing today? Because if the benchmark is the anchor of the planning and the conversation, then everything has to flow from there. There's a bunch of activities you could do to meet a benchmark. But if you pick the activity first, it's very likely that you're trying to sort of fit a round peg in a square hole, or however that saying goes, and you're forcing things, and it's you're not really going to hit that benchmark. So, one of my big pieces of advice is to keep the benchmark as the anchor of the lesson planning and flow from there, and always be checking back to make sure that what you've planned in terms of the activity and all the context goes back and still addresses that benchmark. So here's an example. Again, a very simplified example. So first, we're going to determine the benchmark that we're working for. And this is benchmark 2B ECA. And again, they all have sort of a long letter number situation, but this sort of indicates that this is goal 2, standard B, and then the ECB is a benchmark piece of it. It's, it's a coded system. And the benchmark is with teacher assistance, retell familiar stories with 3 or more key events. So that's the benchmark. Then you can select an activity here. And let's say the activity you want to do is the 3 Little Bears, a felt board story. And then the context you want to build is you're going to do it Monday during literacy at the carpet for 15 minutes. The materials you need are the 3 Little Bears narrative printout. So, the script you're going to read, a felt board, some felt pieces of the bears and Goldilocks, and various household items like a bowl of porridge. The procedure, and what you're going to ask is that you're going to read the story to the children and have the children participate by placing the felt board pieces on felt on the felt board as the narrative progresses. And then to check for understanding, your plan is that during choice time, you're going to walk around and chat with the children individually and say, hey, could you retell that story that you heard, and see if they're able to do that. So, this is the activity that you've built that we're going to kind of work through here. Okay, so again, this is a repeat slide. We're going back to revisit it, but it's this idea that we planned a lesson. The benchmark is going to remain static, but at all the other junctures, the objective, the contextual information, the materials, the teaching plan, and the assessment, we have opportunities to individualize for students who need that. And so we'll talk through this example and think about ways you might do that. Again, I'm not going to be able to very successfully keep up with the chat box, but as we talk through these different ways to individualize, if you have thoughts and ideas of things I haven't put on these slides, feel free to throw them in the chat or jot down your own notes. These are just examples of ways you might individualize. So first thing is you can individualize a lesson by looking at the objectives and seeing where some students might benefit by you adjusting those a little bit. So, and for the sake of this presentation, I just considered vocabulary, but there's other ways to individualize at the objective level. So if you have some advanced learners, you might individualize by targeting more vocabulary words. So maybe for most of the kids, you're targeting 5 vocabulary words. You might have someone where you're going to target 7. You're going to up the ante for someone who's advanced in their verbal skills. If you've got very young learners, if you have a mixed age classroom and you've got some young 3-year-olds or some students who are English language learners, maybe you decide that for them, you're going to target fewer vocabulary words. So you're just going to really focus on 3 instead of 5. Or, that's quantity, but in terms of characteristics of the vocabulary, you might decide a way to individualize is to simplify some of the vocabulary words. So maybe you're teaching the word humongous to everybody, like Papa Bear was humongous. He was just a very humongous bear. But for someone else, you might use the word large or big, a simpler word, same meaning and same introduction of vocabulary, but it's a simpler way to accomplish it. So that's one thing you can do is you can individualize at that juncture. And so as you're planning, you might think about, okay, well, here's my vocabulary words. Who in the class could benefit by me individualizing this to them and making it a little different? The next place is here when we talk about the contextual information. So the when, the where, the how long of the lesson. So you might individualize the when, either for the full lesson or for the assessment. So remember when I kind of outlined this quick lesson, we had said, the assessment is that the teacher will walk around during centers and chat with individual children and say, could you retell that story that you heard? Well, maybe that's just not the best fit for one of the children. Maybe when he's at blocks, like that's just not going to happen. So for that child, you could individualize the when, and you could do his assessment, right after the group is over, or maybe, at a time after he's just had a therapy or something where, he's really focused and primed to really show his stuff the best. You can individualize the where. So you might do this lesson a couple of times and on purpose. One of them is with a smaller group. You could use different seating. So if, it was really important that a child be a certain distance from something, or closer or further away from the teacher to best pay attention, you might position them differently in the room at a certain spot that's most ideal. Or you might individualize by ensuring that child's lesson or portion of the lesson, or even the seat within the group, is at part of the room with fewer distractions. It can be as simple as how a child facing towards the classroom and not towards a door with people walking by. You know, it can be something very simple where you purposefully individualize. You could individualize the duration. So for some children, it might be appropriate to invite them for a smaller portion of the lesson, like maybe you doing your talk ahead of time and then the felt board activity and the chat afterwards is just too much. So they just come for the story to start with. Or you might make it longer for someone. So you might say, I'm going to individualize by giving this child a pre-teaching. You know, I'm going to tell this story to them once before the activity, so they're really ready to participate. Or maybe you're going to do a review afterwards. So again, these are always to individualize the context of the lesson. Then we move on here to the materials. Lots of ways to individualize when we talk about materials. So for a few examples related to this lesson, you know, maybe it's very hard for a student to pay attention to a story going on a felt board if they can't see anything in their own hands. And so maybe you print out a little script of the story that's got some visuals in it, and they follow along at their seat, or they have their own mini felt board, and that really helps them pay attention. Maybe it's hard for someone to handle the felt characters, and so you could attach them to a popsicle stick so it's easier to move them or raise and lower them. Or maybe just handling felt and the positioning of the felt board is really not going to work for somebody in the class, and so you do the story on a smart board instead, and the children can swipe characters from one place to the next, and so you individualize materials that way. You might individualize by providing a simplified narrative, either by doing it the whole activity at a separate time, or just sort of restating portions of the story in a more simple manner. Or you might add a few advanced vocabulary words into the story for some children. So again, lots of ways to individualize when we think about the materials that we're going to use. Then we talk about the teaching plan. So, and some of these categories are going to overlap, the materials and the teaching plan, they're all interlinked. But you might, individualize by providing simpler instructions. So maybe for lots of kids in the class, you're getting them to work on like listening to questions and paying attention to attributes. So you might be saying things to the class like, all right, if you're wearing red, come up to the felt board. Well, that could be too much for someone. And so for that student, you might say, Johnny, come put Papa Bear on the board. You're just simplifying. You might ask questions during the lesson instead of at the end. So you might know that for one child, this full retelling of the story is going to be too much. So maybe you wait until there's key things that happen in the story, and then you say, what happened? And the child says, Goldilocks ran away, and they can do that. They can do those more simple, comprehensive things. You might offer a simplified version of the lesson. You might have fewer characters, maybe just one bear. You might add fewer extra details. You might not go into a bunch of description about the porridge. Again, so that it's something that someone might be able to grasp more easily. Maybe you pair one child with another for participation. And so, so you might say, you two come up and put Papa Bear on the felt board. And so there's not so much pressure on one child to do it. Or you might embed an IEP goal into the lesson. So perhaps you have a student in a class who's working identifying colors or using attribute words like big or small. And so you purposefully put that in your lesson where you're going to say, Johnny, what color is Goldilocks shirt? And then he'll say, oh, it's green. So you're fitting that in. So lots of ways to individualize the teaching plan. And then again, the last one here is the assessment. So you can individualize here. One idea would be to ask yes or no questions or provide fill in the blank sentences instead of saying, your overarching, can you tell that story I told today? Can you retell that to me? You might say, did Goldilocks taste that porridge? And the child just has to say yes or no. Or you could say, oh yeah, baby bear went to his bed and it was, and the child says just right. Like, it's less for the child to do, but they're still showing you some knowledge of that story. You might individualize by letting the children answer by pointing or manipulating characters on the felt board. So instead of having the child tell you what happened, you might invite a child to the felt board and say, here's all these characters, like, you show me. And the child might be able to pull the whole story together that way. Or maybe you let the children pair up and say, hey, you two, come on over here, retell this story to me. And they can bounce off each other's answers and get a sense of how that might work, but not have to do it all on their own. So we've kind of worked through the 5 different parts of the lesson plan here and how you might individualize at every step along the way. So hopefully that was helpful in terms of thinking about how it's not just one juncture, it's all the different spots. And we'll continue to talk about that, but it's good to keep in mind that the individualization is interspersed throughout a lesson plan, and it's not just in one spot, and it's definitely not at the end. So it's not like you plan a whole lesson and then at the end think about what you might do different for certain children. You're thinking about that as you build the lesson. So I'm going to apologize that these slides might be a little bit hard to read. What these are, this slide and the next slide is, they're pages from an article I wrote a while ago. It's from the Young Exceptional Children Monograph 16. I wrote it with a couple of colleagues from Illinois Early Learning. And we talk about this process of individualizing lesson plans. And I'm going to toggle between the 2 slides. The first thing I want to point out is what's on the left side here is a lesson plan. It spans 2 pages, but if you look at it, it's not a crazy, intensely detailed lesson plan. It's got the benchmark, it's got the description of the activity, the materials, the procedure, which includes assessment here. But it's something that would be possible for a teacher to write. Like they might not do the full sentences here or type it all up, but this is a good, reasonable length of a lesson plan. And then what we've done on the right side is talk about the individualization that's going to occur for different students at different junctures in the lesson. So, when we talk about materials, we talk about one child and how we're going to make an individualization by adding a different material. In the procedure part of the lesson, we show how there's a few different children and how we're going to either make a curriculum modification or adaptation to individualize or focus on an IEP goal. And again, those are sort of embedded throughout these slides. And so again, we're not advocating for a certain for a certain format, but I do suggest sort of a left column, right column format to get people in the habit of first planning that lesson with the benchmark anchored on the top. And as they plan it, thinking through the adaptations that correspond to the different parts of the lesson. And because that process of thinking through the individualizations that are needed should occur as you're planning the lesson and not as an afterthought. It should never feel forced. I saw someone ask if they could get a copy or access to this table, and I can send that information to the webinar leader so that they can send it back out to you as well in a better way to view. All right, so that's just an example of kind of what an individualized lesson plan might look like. You've got your benchmark, all of your lesson planning, and then your individualization built as you're building the lesson plan along the other side. This next point is something that I think might be, sorry, someone's asking about the benchmark numbers not shown. I'm sorry, that I would suggest showing the benchmark number on a lesson plan. It's just not on that particular example. That was more to show sort of the left-right situation and how you want to individualize as you go. But this next point here, I think could be another sort of key insight into why teachers might sometimes have trouble individualizing on lesson plans. And that is that teachers individualize already. This I think is interesting in terms of comparing preschool classrooms to maybe upper level classrooms. And it's not to say that teachers in higher grades don't individualize, but I think it's much less intuitive or natural due to the situations they're working in. So for example, I have a 3rd grader and a 5th grader in my family, my children. They talk about kind of going to school and what they do. And I'll know that like the math lesson is, the teacher's at the front of the smartboard, the students are at their desk with maybe a math book and a whiteboard, and everybody's sort of doing the same thing. And so when the teachers individualize, it really is sort of thought through and deliberate and written down because they have to really plan for that specifically before they start. But preschool, as you know, is a different world. And it's wonderful. But if most preschool teachers in inclusive multi-age environments, they individualize all the time. So just some examples that, popped into my head when I was thinking about this. You might go into a class and see a teacher encouraging a young child to sit near an older peer so that they have a role model for a lesson. You might see a teacher working with a child as the class is doing a craft, and the teacher's just handing over the materials one at a time as the student needs them, so they're not overwhelmed by a pile of materials all at once. You might notice a teacher giving extra wait time for a certain student after they ask a question. You might notice a teacher having a student come to a large group a little bit early or stay a little bit late to give them a little extra practice on what they just talked about. You might notice a teacher walk by a table and notice that a child is having trouble gripping a crayon and giving them a fat marker instead, or that the child's paper is sliding around the table and just grabbing a piece of Scotch tape and taping it down so that the child can work without difficulty. And so the thing is, teachers are doing this. Those are all great individualizations, but they're doing it so well and so naturally that they're probably not thinking to put it on a lesson plan because it truly is just second nature. I mean, having been a preschool teacher, as many of you probably have been, and you see this all the time, that's just sort of how you live in a preschool classroom. You could never get through your day if you expected everyone to do the same thing all the time. And you know that, and you work accordingly. But then it makes it hard to notice all the ways that you're individualizing because it's so natural. So one suggestion that you could do to support teachers is to come and observe a lesson. Maybe you have them write the lesson plan and don't even put the individualizations on it, but say, send me your lesson plan. I'm going to come watch the lesson. And then you watch and you see all the places that they've individualized and write those down, and maybe do that a couple of times, or have teachers watch a peer teacher, do some instruction. Because I think once it's pointed out to people and they could see this list of ways that they're individualizing, it's much easier to then say, oh gosh, I individualized materials for that child. I individualized my questions for that child. I individualized my assessment for that child. And then it's just a matter of putting it on a lesson plan. So I really do think that a lot of times it's just a matter of noticing and getting it on the plan versus whether or not it's being done. So that's another kind of key point to keep in mind, I'd say. All right. Now that we've kind of worked through those ideas, I do want to get to this juncture in the presentation where we talk about the differences between individualization and accommodations, and also UDL, which we'll talk about next, and we'll talk about how all those three things interact together. So first, just starting out with some definitions here. So individualization is a changes to a specific lesson or teaching opportunity for a specific student, or we could say individual student. Note that individualization is not the same as small group instruction. So pulling out a group of kids who either are heterogeneous or homogeneous sort of in skill, that's not individualization, that's grouping. Individualization, really focus on that word individual, is what you're doing for a specific student. And accommodations are strategies in a child's IEP. So if you have a child with an individual education program who has a disability, and those things might include things like providing preferential seating or using an FM system. So it's an accommodation is something in the IEP that we're told we're going to do that all the time as a support for that student. And when we think about individualization and or accommodations, they sometimes exist together, they sometimes exist separately, and you might see a teacher incorporate either one or both of them. So the first example here, often a teacher will incorporate both individualization and accommodation. So an example is an accommodation of an FM system could amplify a lesson for a student who needs it. But then that child also needs the individualization of simplified vocabulary for a particular lesson. So in that case, both the accommodation and the individualization, they do a different thing, but the child needs both of them to maximize their potential. But sometimes well thought out accommodation might render some individualization unnecessary. So example, if the main struggle a child has is attention and seating, but they have an IEP or a 405 plan that says they get a wiggle seat, that might be all that the child needs to sufficiently be supported in terms of focus. And at that point, you don't need another individualization. So I think one thing to think about is, individualizations on a lesson should not be just people's accommodations, because those are guarantees. They're on an IEP. They should be things that are specific to that lesson and that child's, but you keep the accommodations in place if needed. And sometimes, as this second example here, that's all you need. You don't need other ones. Now, the next slide, we'll talk about when we talk about individualization versus accommodation, we're talking about one student. Whereas when we talk about universal design for learning, it's more of sort of comparing individualization to accommodations you might make for everyone. So I'm not sure how familiar people are with universal design for learning, but it's based off the idea of universal design, which is an architectural term. So it's when people began thinking about spaces and materials that had this universal design that was helpful to certain people, but it was good for everyone. So if you think about like a ramp going into a building, or a doorway that sort of, you might see them in like libraries or airport bathrooms now, where you kind of go in, but you don't have to push a door. Like they're very helpful if you're in a wheelchair, but they're fine for everyone. Maybe kitchen utensils with a fat grip on them. They're great for people with motor needs. They're perfectly fine for everyone too. So the idea is universal. So is extra helpful for some people, but appropriate for everyone. And so when we talk about these definitions, again, individualization, it's that same definition, changes to a specific lesson or teaching opportunity for one child. And again, noting that's not the same as small group instruction, versus universal design for learning, which is making a lesson more flexible so that all or most children have access to the content without additional specific changes. So like an example of that is, let's say you plan an activity and the children are going to color with crayons. That's part of the activity, part of your materials. And you put them out, and you have one child with some poor grip strength, and he cannot press the crayon hard enough to make a line. And so maybe you would individualize the lesson by giving him a marker. That'd be individualizing and making it accessible to that child, but everybody else is using crayons. But if you change the lesson, and instead of offering just crayons and said, you can do this with crayons, markers, or paint. And that child does fine gripping a paintbrush. And even if he can't press super hard on a marker is different. It's going to make that line anyway. Well, now the design of the lesson makes it so it's available to that child. And so now you don't need to individualize because you've built in that flexibility. So they work sort of in tandem like that. And one principle to keep in mind is that most teaching experiences will benefit from a balance of UDL and targeted individualization. So thinking of what you can do to make it accessible to the most people, but then also thinking about who still needs some individual work. And I kind of like to think of it as like a continuum of a sliding scale. So the more you can do on the end of UDL, the less you might have to do in terms of individualization. Or another way you can think of it is, the more you do in UDL, the more it frees you up to do some really high quality individualization. So if you're not worried about everybody using the materials correctly, then your individualization could be something more advanced, like really targeting a different, set of vocabulary or actual skills for a certain child. So we think about using them together. And, again, the teachers in your classroom, I'm sure, are all doing individualizing and, UDL and implementing accommodations from their students' IEPs. So it's a matter of kind of noticing when those all occur and pointing them out. One resource we have here included on the slide is just a blog from Illinois Early Learning, and it's called Which to Choose, Universal Design for Learning or Accommodations. And it kind of talks through that process of, well, how do you know which one should I pick? When is it the most appropriate time to do either one of those things? And hopefully that's a helpful resource to you. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through all of that, let's see if we can take a little time as a sort of a mental exercise to walk through a practice case study example. And again, just because of the number of people and the timing, it might be more of a mental exercise you do, but it's good to get thinking through the process. So here's our simplified case study. We're starting with our benchmark, 6B ECB, show understanding of how to count out and construct sets of objects of a given number up to 5. It's one of our math benchmarks. All right, we got our benchmarks. Now we're going to pick our activity. We're going to have the children count pennies to pay for items in the classroom shoe store. So in your dramatic play, you've got a shoe store set up. You've got shoe boxes and old shoes. They've got price tags on them. And you've got coin purses with pennies in them. So you're going to do this Tuesday during centers at dramatic play. You're anticipating the kids will come and stay for 10 to 15 minutes. Your materials, like I said, you've got your price tags on your shoe boxes. You've got your coin purses full of pennies for the shoppers. And your procedure is just that you're going to invite children to a dramatic play, or they'll come on their own, and you'll say, hey, why don't you buy some shoes? And the buyer looks at the shoebox to see how many pennies they have to count out. They count them out. And then the cashier takes the money and checks it for accuracy. You know, all these shoes cost 5 pennies or less. And so you're watching them to see if they can count out and construct those sets of a number up to 5. And your assessment is just that you're observing and you're seeing how many pennies the children can count accurately up to 5. So that's your benchmark and your plan for accomplishing it. Then, and again, feel free to throw ideas in the chat, especially for your fellow attendees to take a look at here. But let's start out with your objectives, including vocabulary. The vocabulary you're choosing to focus on is penny, cost, and pay. So what are some ways you might individualize that vocabulary list for different students? Think about how, especially as we work through this, if you can think of particular students in your program, this might come to life a little bit more. You know, the students who might benefit from these different types of individualization. Then you've got your contextual information. This is supposed to happen Tuesday at dramatic play during centers for 10 to 15 minutes. How might you individualize that portion, the context or setting for someone who needs a little bit different setting to be successful? You've got your materials. So what you've got planned is price tags, coin purses, and pennies. But how might you individualize those materials to still accomplish that same benchmark, you know, within this general activity? You've got your teaching plan, including your methods and questions for students. So what you're planning is that children will purchase the shoes with pennies and the cashier will check their payment for accuracy. And then you've got your assessment, which is that you're planning to observe. So at all these junctures, think of ways that you might individualize the plan for a certain student. And also, you know, you might think of ways separate from individualizing where you might put some UDL into this lesson, or you might think about a student who has an IEP, and really once you've put in their accommodations, they don't need an individualization. So these are the sorts of things you think through when you're working through your lesson planning. And, you know, as a teacher, you know, I just made this very concrete and thought about like my actual students in my class. And usually what I would do is kind of, you know, maybe have a class picture in front of me or think about the kids. And I would say, who might have trouble with this vocabulary list? What kind of trouble might they have? How could I fix that? You know, who might have a little difficulty with this context? Once you make it very concrete, you can think about individualizations that are, you know, helpful and necessary, because you really don't want to just be individualizing for the sake of putting something on a paper. And there's always ways to individualize to help certain students maximize their potential without forcing it. So that's, you know, a good lesson to think through, kind of think through that lesson plan. That lesson plan is actually from, and thank you for someone putting an idea in the chat, super helpful. That actual lesson is from our website. Obviously, there's a lot more if you go to our website. But we have a whole section called Adapting Lesson Plans to Meet the IELTS Benchmarks. So this exact thing where the lesson is anchored in a benchmark, we work through the process and we talk about all the ways you might individualize for different types of students. And you know, I'm not sure if I said this at any point, but it's not just children with disabilities who benefit from individualizing. So all sorts of students for various reasons might benefit from that. So this link here in the slide will take you right to that lesson. You can get our take on it, but then you can see a whole bunch of other lessons that have been individualized and adapted. And, you know, I'd say if the teachers you're working with are having some trouble thinking through these ideas, that's a great place to take them. Maybe say, you know, find a group of teachers, tell them all to read 2 or 3 of these lessons, and then meet up to chat about it and think about, you know, strategies they might have gained from looking at those lesson plans on our website. Because they're lengthier than you would probably write as a teacher, but they do serve the purpose of being that reflective tool and helping a teacher kind of think through the process. So a few other IEL resources that I want to highlight. Again, we have these adapting lesson plans to meet the IELTS benchmarks, a whole section, which is linked here in the slides. We have a whole blog series on curriculum modifications. So those are those simple changes to materials or instructions that teachers can use. And it's a nice review for teachers who are thinking about how they might individualize, because these are all, relatively simple modifications that you could do for particular students to individualize. And then, of course, just, I'm sorry, someone says the link is not working. I can make sure to send that through with Susie or the center, so you get the correct link. And then just you could look for our link on inclusive settings, because again, the whole point of individualizing lesson plans is to make your environment more inclusive so that all the students can be successful. And lesson planning is just one tool in your toolbox of many that can help that happen. And so, it's part of the larger teaching plans. So that is the end of everything I wanted to officially share with you today. We do have time for questions. I have the Illinois Early Learning email address, and definitely if you have not come to our website often, I invite you to come often, take a look around. We are good at answering our email, so if you need resources, we're happy to find those for you or share links. We're probably best known for our tip sheets on a variety of topics. But again, we do house the Illinois Early Learning Standards. So I will stop chatting and let you all ask any questions that you might have right now.
Emily, can I make a clarification about something that was asked earlier regarding the benchmarks? When we're looking at lesson plans from a monitoring standpoint, we do just the number of the benchmark is not enough. We do look for the keyword or phrase. So if you look at the compliance checklist in number 10, it does state you need to have the keyword or phrase on there as well.
Oh, okay. I didn't mean to convey otherwise.
No, it's okay.
Okay,
I just wanted
yeah.
to clarify that based on the question that was asked. Yeah.
Better? Thank you for the person who's Jay Walker, who said it'd be great for the teachers to listen to. I think that's very nice. Hopefully that would be helpful. I'm not sure I'm the best person to address the teaching strategies goals and teaching strategies cloud. Jenny, would that be you?
I think that's an opinion thing. Maybe somebody in the chat who uses that can give their opinion about that.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize. I'm not on top of the current teaching strategies goal tools. So I would not be the one. But what I can tell you is that on our website, we have crosswalks between the Illinois Early Learning and Development Standards and some of the other common curriculums like teaching strategies goals and a few others. And so if you are looking to see how those align in planning to make sure they kind of lined up across teaching strategies and IELTS, we have a tool to help with that.
Okay. May I speak for a second? I guess I was just asking on the teaching strategies. It comes out like a full 2-page lesson plan. We can add our standards in, we can do all that, but just didn't know how maybe to enrich that. If anybody's had any experience with it, what I can tell my teachers to, get them to. A lot of times it kind of comes pre-formed. You put the study in, it puts all of the, it makes the lesson plan for you basically. And then they put in their standards and maybe some individualized learning on there. I'm trying to get them to do that. It's getting kind of difficult. But we had them put that in. Is the pre-formed, I don't know. I don't know if they're teaching with intentionality with it. I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out ways to enrich that.
I can't speak specifically to that tool, but if you look on our website under early childhood and on ISB, we do have a couple examples of different lesson plans, and they're kind of a variety of like very detailed to not very detailed. So maybe that can give you some idea of a way that
Okay.
you could enhance yours.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just address to Angela of how my district uses the teaching strategies to do more of the individualization for that layout? That's
Yes.
kind of prefabricated. A lot of my teachers will put in how they're doing those accommodations, or if it is more of the differentiated for each individual student. So if it says like under their circle time or large group, they would then just use the first letter of the first name, last name, and kind of put in what that is. So it's more specific. So if I were to come in and look at it, or anyone as a sub, they would know how they're making those adjustments. So it is still on that template, but they're able to individualize it.
Okay.
If that helps at all for you.
Yeah, yeah. I said, this is all new and they're enjoying just the one click, and it kind of makes their lesson plan for the next 6 weeks. But they have to still go in, do the individualized learning. They still have to do the benchmarks. They still have to do some of that stuff, but they seem to like that. But I'm just kind of wanting them to put their ideas in to get them to kind of make the lessons their own, but that's been kind of a struggle, so.
There's also a question in there about individualization. It says, would listing individualization for students within specific activities also meet the requirement of individualization for each student each month? Absolutely. That's what we're looking for. The only thing is that you need to make sure that it's like the individualization is also included. So not just the child's name by the activity. What about the activity is being individualized for that child?
Okay. All right. Yeah, they've just got an area where you can put in the individualized learning, but I didn't know if it'd be better with each lesson to have them put it in there. You know, if we're doing a large or small group activity, and then we want to go on to the individualized learning, we've got, you know, to relate it. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just like the accommodations and all that. Should the accommodations, I guess I'm asking, go in each box, or should that go somewhere else?
Angela, I was actually referring to a different question in the box
Oh,
here.
I'm sorry.
So maybe
Okay.
maybe we could talk more, but I think you guys might be asking the same thing. Like,
Sure, let's just-
individualization can be put anywhere as long as we can connect it to an activity. So it can be in the box, or it can be on a separate page. But if it's on a separate page, it has to be able to tell where on the lesson plan and what activity it's linked towards. So it's really up to your team as to how to best do that.
And the accommodations, like IEP accommodations, you know, there's certain accommodations that a child is going to use all day long. And then there's other accommodations that they might just need for specific activities. Like right now, our teachers have a specific box for individualization and a specific box for IEP accommodations. And that's where those things get listed. The IEP accommodation box stays the same every week because those are the accommodations that child utilizes. But then the individualization changes, and there's almost a focus on certain children. But now from this training, I'm seeing how it can be more natural within each component of the lesson plan when an individualization is needed for a child. We just have to make sure that all children are getting some sort of individualization, and that's for the compliancy component.
Right, you got it.
Thank you.
I saw one question from I was up here, Natalie Doyle, about any tools, resources, or thoughts related to teachers convening to share and review lesson plans as a collective group, such as during a PLC. I think one idea is you can go to that link I shared, that I'm sorry, it wasn't working. But I think someone maybe put it in the chat for the adapting lesson plans to meet IELTS benchmarks. And you could almost do it as like a learning exercise where you read the lesson plan first. And then there's a bunch of drop-down menus that talk about adaptations you might make for different types of students. And you could first have the group discuss, well, what do you think? What might be a good way to individualize for like a young 3-year-old or for a student who's having some behavior difficulties? And then open the tab together and kind of see what we came up with and discuss, if you had more or different ideas. That would be sort of a built-in, learning exercise. You could just use our website for that. And I think it's, if your program allows, I know schedules are so tight, but again, if you can have someone observe teachers observe each other, just to notice those individualizations that are being put into play but aren't being written down, that can just be huge to have someone pointing out to you all the different ways you're already individualizing. So even if that could fit into some sort of PLC activity leading to discussion later, I think that could be really helpful. It has a official wrap up you need to do right now. Would you like me to stop sharing my slides?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Emily. I think Susie probably has a couple announcements, but if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email us.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your patience through today. Technology was not on everyone's side. Anyway, we just wanted to let you know that we will be hosting 2 upcoming administrator forums. The next one will be February 8th, and it's building a statewide system to improve equity and access in early learning. And that is going to be with Sonia Clark. She is the Director of Operations with Birth to 5. And then the session following that one will be March 8th. And that is creating equitable learning opportunities. And that is going to be presented by Dr. Eliana Alanis. And so registration for both of those sessions are open at the eclearningil.org website. And you can, as I said, that is open. So you are welcome to register for those at this time. You will be getting a follow-up email following this session. While we used to share the recorded link in that email, we now will post it on the actual YouTube website for ECPL. So if you have not subscribed to that, you can do so through the eclearningil.org website. And at the bottom of the page, you can just navigate to the YouTube, click on it, and you can subscribe. And you will be able to see all the previous administrator forum sessions from this year, as well as recordings of the webinars of PD that we have hosted for all the educational leaders. And thanks, Ken, everybody.
Thanks.
Have
Thank
a
you.
wonderful evening. Thank
Yes.
you.
See you the next time. Bye.